This is Dan Schneider on this Dan Schneider video interview. The subject is the life and career of television producer Sherwood Schwartz. I have his daughter Hope Juba, and the conversation will begin in a moment. The life and career of American television producer Sherwood Schwartz is my subject today. Just for people watching this, there seems to be a slight issue with Skype today, so Hope's video is slightly desynced, so maybe we can just pretend she's calling from Japan as Godzilla's coming in, because it's like an old Godzilla movie. But anyway, I want to thank Hope for appearing. And for those people who do not know, let me just first ask about your father and then yourself, because I grew up watching Gilligan's Island reruns and the Brady Bunch when it was on the first time, and those are the two most famous shows your father's known for. But for those who don't know your father, can you just give a little bit of background about who he was?
Yes, he was born in Passaic and raised for a long time in New Jersey and then into New York, into the Bronx. And he started out and wanting to be a doctor, actually. He was very focused on becoming a doctor. He always wanted to cure big diseases, and he was going to pre-med school. And his brother was writing jokes for Bob Hope. And every once in a while, my dad, who was a really funny man, great way of words, would sell a joke to Bob Hope for a little extra money. And that's how the whole thing started.
Well,
he became,
go ahead.
Sorry?
No, I'm sorry. I thought you were done. Go ahead.
I could be done.
No, go ahead.
So he started working for Bob Hope, and when the war broke out, he became an Armed Force radio writer and did a lot of the shows there, and USO kind of shows, and something called Mail Call and Jubilee, and when the war ended and he was deciding what to do next, he was taken on as one of the writers for Bob Hope's show, and his life kind of went from becoming a doctor to becoming a comedy writer. And there's a whole lot more to talk about, but you may have some questions.
Yeah, well, I'm just looking up. He had an older brother, Al, who was already established, it seemed, in the radio business. So did he help your father get inside?
Yes, he did. He was the one who suggested to Bob Hope that every once in a while he could buy a joke from my dad, and he really opened the door for that. And my Uncle Al was a very wonderful, gentle, very funny man, and he spent a lot of time on different shows as well, and he worked a lot with Groucho Marx. In fact, there was a really funny story, because my grandmother loved Groucho Marx's show, You Bet Your Life. And she was always saying how Groucho Marx was so brilliant coming up with all these lines. And my Uncle Al would say, you know, Mom, I actually write a lot of the show. And my grandmother would get very furious, because my grandma was really a very stubborn woman. And she would get furious with him and says, no, you don't. He makes all that stuff up. And so finally my Uncle Al brought a script for You Bet Your Life and said, Rosie, Grandma, I call her Grandma, but he said to her, see, here's a script for next week's show. I wrote the show. And she took it and threw it in the fireplace. Wouldn't talk about it.
Let me just ask about the background of your family, because you're ethnically, I guess, Jewish. Did your parents immigrate from Eastern Europe or from the Soviet Union, or what was before then?
Grandparents. My grandparents on both sides. My dad's parents, and they came in from Russia, Lithuania, and Latvia areas. And then my grandparents on my mother's side came in from Austria, Poland area.
Okay. I'm adopted, but my adopted mother was originally from Lithuania. I remember she moved back with her parents in the mid-20s, and then she left that area because of Stalin. And I just saw, interestingly enough, your father was 1 week to the day older than my dad. My dad was born November 21st, 1916. Yours was the 14th, 1916. So,
yes.
So what do you know what your father's family was? Was it just he and his brother Al, or were there other other siblings, were they also involved in comedy, or maybe vaudeville was still around then?
There were other siblings. In fact, when my dad had an older sister named Lily,
Mhm.
and Uncle Al, who was his older brother. And then when my grandmother was pregnant with my father, they also had two other children, two boys named Harry and Milton. And both the sons died during the time that my grandmother was pregnant with my father. And one died from had a roller skating accident, fell down, and somehow it burst his appendix, and he went into shock and died. And he was about, I think, 4 or 5. And then the other brother got spinal meningitis and died from that. And both of them within the pregnancy of my grandmother with my dad. And my grandmother almost lost my dad because of her inability to eat and sleep, and she just was screaming so much and crying so much that the doctor said, Rosie, if you continue this way, you're going to lose this baby. So she really concentrated on just being growing my dad. And so when he was born, he was the thing that everybody believed saved my grandmother. And she was as I said, a very stubborn and a kind of a strange woman. And she made no bones about it that my dad was the little prince. He was the one that everybody doted on and was the real savior of the family. So, and then there was a little later on, quite a few years later on, there was another son named Elroy.
Yeah.
That was my Uncle Elroy.
Yeah, and he's most known for writing for Gilligan's Island as well.
Yes.
I want to get back to your father's early childhood and formation, but before I do, just want to just sort of limb out the family history, because the Schwartzes are quite well known. Elroy was well known for work on Gilligan's Island, as was, I believe, your older brother Lloyd. So can you tell me a little bit about your growing up and your siblings? Did you grow up in Hollywood, I would assume, right?
Well, in Studio City.
Okay.
Kind of Hollywood adjacent, yeah. And when I grew up, I was the youngest. I am the youngest. I have 3 older brothers. I have Don, Lloyd, and Ross. And Don, my oldest brother, is an ophthalmologist, and he does eye surgery and things like that. And my younger brother, Ross, but he's not younger than me, but he's my youngest of the 3. He is an entertainment attorney, and he also is a writer. He wrote a movie that got made probably about 10 years ago. And my middle brother, Lloyd, was the one that worked most closely with my father on most of his shows, and I work a lot with my brother, Lloyd.
Do you still work with Lloyd, and is it in the entertainment industry?
Yes, I work with Lloyd often. And we do any incarnation of Brady or Gilligan projects that are up, the musicals and the various spin-offs and things like that. I usually am involved with those with my brother Lloyd. And he has his own things that he writes. He writes plays and does his own script writing, and I do mine as well separately. I have other writing partners that I work with as well, but we often get together and write things, yes.
Well, I'll get more into that later. I do know that I initially found you in Googling your father, an organization called playscripts.com. And were you writing, what sorts of plays have you written or gotten produced? Are we talking like Lillian Hellman? Are we talking Noel Coward stuff, or what?
With my background, it's hardly no, mostly comedy.
Okay.
I wrote the one that Playscripts has recently published is a play called Without Annette. Annette, the girl's name, but also Annette, because it is a scripted comedy that's set in an improvisation workshop.
Okay.
I had the concept that if you set a comedy or any play in an improvisation workshop, then when you got to the places in the show where they were going to do a game or a scene, that they could actually be improvised, so you could integrate improvisation with a scripted play.
Mhm.
And I thought that that would be a really unique way to do a show because it would be different every night and there would be pockets and roadmaps on how to get back into the script. So we produced that in LA a few times, and then the play scripts people in New York had heard about it and wanted to publish it. So that was my recent publishing.
Well, let me turn back to your father's youth and what you know of it, because like most families, I'm sure you probably have old albums, photo albums, and oh, there's Aunt Betsy and there's Uncle Saul or whatnot. Did your father have a large extended family? And growing up in Passaic in the teens and 1920s, was that urbanized then, or was it more farmland? Do you know?
It was what he dealt with was more urbanized. My grandfather had a grocery store,
Mhm.
and so they were in a city, and they had like an upstairs downstairs apartment building
Mhm.
that they lived in. And there's a story that my dad always told because my grandmother, as I mentioned before, was quite a character, and my dad was at one point throwing a toy down, and the people down below were getting very annoyed with his throwing the toy down because they could keep hearing it, and they came up and they complained, and then they complained to the landlord that my dad was throwing his toy down, and my grandmother got furious uh, and made my grandfather buy the apartment building and kick those people out. But my
Uh,
dad
yeah.
keep on throwing that toy down.
Well, you said that your grandparents originally had come over from Russia. Were they secular Jews? Were they radical anarchists? Were they communists? Well, I mean, back in the early part of the 20th century, there was a lot of stuff going on, especially from people who came from Eastern Europe. Were you know were you did your father have to take a bar mitzvah, or was your family pretty secular?
My dad had a bar mitzvah. It was always really an important part of his identity. His parents were escaping Cossacks, kind of Russian
Mhm.
things where they were like clearing people out, and my grandfather got a kind of wind of it and decided to sell. I think there's some kind of story where he had bought something like a big parcel of land, sold it, and used that money to take his whole family out because he had heard that there was like a cleansing that was going to happen. So he escaped that way,
Uh,
and it was an important part of my dad's identity. He was never he never like imposed it on anybody or felt that it was important that anybody else felt the way he did. In fact, my mother and my father didn't always agree on spiritual matters, but for dad, it was in, he there was I remember there was one story where he was applying to a school, and the counselor that he was talking to said, you need to change your name from Sherwood Schwartz to maybe Sherwood White or something, so that you are not looked at in the paperwork as Jewish because they have a quota system. And my dad refused to do it. He said, "No, I'm Sherwood Schwartz. I'm Jewish, and they'll either take me or not take me for who I am."
Yeah, it's odd because my last name is Schneider, and I'm well. I was adopted. My parents were full German. It's just odd that I mean, I could understand maybe if it was Teitelbaum. Well, even that's a Germanic, but it's odd how like when a lot of Jews came to America, names that had before, let's say in the 19th century, been fully associated with just German or Polish or Eastern European, always they were told to change the name because it had people didn't want to be thought of as Jewish, even if the three-quarters of the people with those names were German or Polish or whatnot. Was your father aware of that sort of discrimination? I mean, the no Jews allowed kind of thing. Did he have any
Yeah,
stories about that?
yeah, he was very aware of it. In fact, there was a quota that in trying to get into medical school, they were filled up. They had enough Jews, so they wouldn't let my dad in.
Oh.
And he was put on the waiting list of one medical school. In fact, he'd gotten a telegram said that he was first in the waiting list, but they'd had a Jewish quota, so they weren't allowing him in, and that if anything changed, they would let him know. And this was way back in 19, I don't know, 20 something, 30 something, I don't know. I'm not good with numbers, but when he would be applying to medical school. And many, many years later, because my dad was a practical joker and he just loved to follow up on things. So when he was about 85 years old, he sent that school a telegram or a letter saying, I've been very patient, but I must get on with my life.
Mhm. Now, before I talk actually about his start in radio, let me just talk about World War II, because your father would have been 24 or 25, 25, I guess, when Pearl Harbor hit. Was your father drafted? Did he get an exemption? Did he go on tour with the USO with Bob Hope, for example?
Yes, he was drafted, and he said he was always protecting Santa Monica because they had a studio down there that he was working at, and he did join the USO tours. And his job was to be a comedy writer and entertain the troops. And he and my mother had met the prior year, a year before Pearl Harbor, and had a courtship that whole year. And my dad had coincidentally asked my mother to marry him the day before Pearl Harbor. And when the news broke, they decided to hurry that along. And so my mom came out from New York, and they got married 2 weeks later. And my dad was in the Army, went through basic training. I think he was in San Luis Obispo for basic training. And then he was just doing all the radio shows and Bob Hope's USO tours and things like that.
Just looking, there seems to be a story that you were possibly named after Bob Hope. Is that correct?
A lot of people thought that because my name is Hope. And when I was born, my dad was actually working for Red Skelton and got a telegram saying, "What's wrong with Skelton Schwartz?" But but I was not named after Bob Hope. I was named after my grandfather Herman, and they didn't think Herman was a very good name for a girl, and so they took the H, and because they had 3 boys, and they decided to try one more time, and they were really hoping for a girl. I was their Hope.
Okay. Well, let's talk about Bob Hope, because just looking online, it looks like was that the first radio show that your father worked for, Bob Hope's?
Yes, I believe so. And he was. It was during that time when war was breaking out. He was dating my mother, and he was working with his brother, and they were all working on Bob Hope's shows.
Now, probably that era is best chronicled in Woody Allen's film Radio Days, even though it didn't use the actual shows. It had faux kind of shows like that. Was the Bob Hope show the kind of thing that writing for it made a name for your father in the industry, or was it just in L.A., or was it broadcast across I guess I would assume CBS or NBC?
I think he got a reputation as being a really creative, innovative joke writer, and he really enjoyed it. He loved working for Bob Hope. He loved his sense of humor. He loved the pace of it. He loved the challenge of it. He did get a very good reputation working there, but after a while, there was something inside of him that he felt like he wanted to move into more situational and not do like monologue type joke writing, but more situational type joke writing, which is when he went to Bob. And I guess not many people did that. Not many people would go to Bob Hope and say, I'm leaving. But he did, because he just felt like his calling was more situational rather than monologue.
So was the Bob Hope show on radio then sort of like the Carol Burnett show was on television, just skits and stand up?
Yes.
Okay.
There was a lot of character work type skits. Like I think that my dad's favorite other performer that he worked with Bob Hope was Judy Garland. He thought she was a phenomenon, and he was very sad to see the progress of what happened with her and how she was being treated and molded, and but he worked with lots of songwriters would come on the shows, like Jerome Kern and people like that, and my dad would he would work a lot with the songwriters. He for some reason he was put in charge of them on the radio shows.
Now, Ozzie and Harriet, people my age or older are going to be familiar with the name. I'm in my early 50s. But a lot of people don't recognize that it did start out on radio. So your father was writing for the radio version of Ozzie and Harriet. When did he start doing that? And this obviously was a prototype for what became situation comedies on television.
I couldn't give you an exact year. I could probably look it up, but I don't really know offhand.
Yeah, okay, that's fine.
I don't know what the year was, but I know that was his feeling of leaving the just joke comedy and going to situational. And he worked on Ozzie and Harriet and the Beulah Show and a few other radio shows that were more situational.
When you say that he preferred situational, was that because he drew or could more easily draw experiences from his own family life? Or did he often do that, do you think?
I never heard that from him. I always felt, and he always just seemed to be drawn to creating situations and solving problems that way. I think that the fact that in a situational episode, you got to address a certain thing, and by the end of it, and I think that shows in his work later on, that was always a call to him. He felt very strongly in the ability of people to work out problems, and I think that was more easily done in a long-form situational than in just like a joke monologue, where it was just basically a string of jokes. Some led into the others, but it wasn't so much of an entertainment piece on itself of a whole.
And then I see he also wrote for the Alan Young Show, and again, a lot of these names are familiar to me because I have parents that were about almost the same age as your parents. But for people, nowadays, this is a name that's long forgotten. Why did your father? Did he ever say, was he dissatisfied at Ozzie and Harriet? Did he get a better offer from the Alan Young Show? Because was he a hot property then? Or?
I really didn't hear very much about his change then. He never really talked to me about that. The only thing I ever heard about Ozzie and Harriet was that Ozzie had a particular fondness for one laugh track, and he would use it every single time, and it was like driving my dad crazy. But other than that, I really didn't hear about it. I don't think that was the reason he left.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'm using an assortment of websites, including Wikipedia, so that there are probably gaps. It says here, the next thing that's listed on Wikipedia is that he was writing for I Married Joan, which was a Joan Davis show. So was that his first television job, or did he do local television in the meantime between radio and a network gig?
I think that was his first TV job, and he loved Joan Davis. He felt very strongly that she was such a strong comedian, and he just thought she was extraordinarily talented, and he believed that her show suffered because it was always being compared to Lucy, and there was nobody could compare to Lucy. And so I think that but that was his first introduction to Jim Backus, and he loved working on that show. He had one story where Joan was supposed to be working with this chimpanzee, and they gave her all sorts of lessons on how to hold the chimpanzee and what she was supposed to do and what she wasn't supposed to do. And at one point, the chimpanzee actually bit her, and she had to go in for these shots to make sure she was okay. And the next day, my dad called in to see if she was okay, and he was told she was fine, but the monkey died.
Was your dad a part of the writing team, or was he the head writer?
That one, I think he was a part of the team.
And then you had mentioned Red Skelton earlier. It looks like he did right after I Married Joan. He went to the Skelton Show. Now that was a variety show, from what I can see, and so that wasn't a situation comedy. Did he just take that in the interim while he at this time in the mid-50s? Did he have ideas for some of the later shows, and he was sending them around, and he just took that on the interim? Because he said that he preferred situation comedy to
Well,
skits.
he was very reluctant. Actually, he didn't want to join the Red Skelton show. Not so much because it wasn't situational. He thought Red was very talented, but he had heard that he was notoriously horrible to his writers. So in fact, there was one story where in the writers' room, Red Skelton took a gun out and like shot near the feet of some of the writers because he was so angry with them. So my dad said to his agent, "I'm really not wanting to take this particular job, and I will only consider it if it is in my contract that I never have to actually meet with Red Skelton." So he had a contract that was offered to him, and I guess they really wanted him because that was in his contract. So my dad worked on the show for years and never met him.
Huh, that's interesting. Well, let me just ask before I move on that. Since your father later became the producer of several television shows, the two most famous ones I mentioned, and we'll talk about more in depth later, did these lessons as being, I guess you'd call it just an employee or being part of the system, did that affect his outlook on how he treated the other actors on his shows later? Because from what I've read, and you can't see it because I turned off my thing, but I have your father's book, Inside Gilligan's Island, and I've seen a number of the inside stories from the assorted Brady kids as they grew up, that your father was a genuinely genial and good to work for, from what other than I guess Robert Reed might have disagreed, but other than that, he seemed to have had a good reputation. Was that forged by some of the things he might have gone through with on his earlier career?
I think partially that, but I think partially because my dad was my dad. I mean, he was just genuinely a very warm-hearted, optimistic, um, people kind of person. He just loved people, and he wanted everybody to be happy what they were doing, and I think that he learned from other people's not being that way that it doesn't really accomplish much, and I think that he was just was more part of just who he was.
So right around the time when he was doing the Skelton Show, you were born. What was your family life then? Because you were considerably younger than your three older brothers. I think it's 7 years younger than the next youngest sibling. So that's an eternity when you're a child. If you're in kindergarten, your next brother is just about hitting puberty. Were you then raised basically as almost like a de facto only child, or were you daddy's
Yeah.
girl? Or
I was very much, there was like the three boys, because my oldest brother was 13 years older than I was. So there were the three boys who were 3 years apart, each of them, and they were kind of this group. And then I came along much later. So my oldest brother, Don, I thought he was my uncle for a while, because he was in college. He would come in every once in a while, but he wasn't really around very much.
uh-huh.
And I think that a lot of their parenting happened for the three boys, and then later I was wanted. They had planned me, but I was kind of we got our girl, and they were busy doing other things, because when I was born and my dad was really busy, he had won his Emmy, and he was like going on to other TV shows and things, so he was really busy with that. My mom had done all her kind of parenting with the three boys. I think she was kind of tired of it, and so by the time I came around, there wasn't as much kind of just hands-on parenting, and I think the times had changed so much, because I was more in the 60s and they were more in the 50s, and they were still thinking that things were 50s like, and when I was growing up, that in a way it was great for me, because I didn't have all that much supervision, but in a way I didn't have very much supervision. So.
And your dad won the Emmy for what, Skelton?
Yes.
Okay.
I remember The night he won it, he and my mom were all dressed up. They were going out, and my dad said to me, "If I'm he said about himself, if I'm very, very lucky, I'll bring you a golden doll to play with." And he did.
So let me just ask then about your childhood. We talked a little bit about your siblings. Did you grow up in a fairly well-to-do part of the LA area, or did you go to a private school? Were you in public school? Were you anointed sort of the next Shirley Temple by your parents? Did they want you to go into show business or what?
Absolutely not.
No?
Absolutely not. We were in public school. It was a nice house. Nothing. No, it was not a mansion. There was no like fancy cars. There was.
So you weren't the Tori Spelling before Tori Spelling.
No, no. And I was told that I think it goes back to my mom's upbringing and what she was doing. My dad had a different feel for it, but my mom told me when I was growing up I had three choices. I could either be a secretary, an airline stewardess, or a teacher. Those were my only options. And I was grappling with this for a long time because I couldn't type. I was terrified of flying. And I didn't think that I'd make a very good teacher. And I was like, I didn't know how. And my dad was meanwhile hiring some of the first female directors and writers. And I think my mom was very much of the 50s women are housewives and doing this. But I think my dad even brought that along with him somewhat too into Brady, because Carol Brady, people would say, well, she has a housekeeper doing the work, and she at that point had no job. Although later on in the legend or lore of Brady, she eventually became, I believe, a real estate agent. But earlier on, she had all these kids, and Alice was doing a lot of the taking care of, and it was like, what exactly was she doing? You know?
Yeah. I want to move on to my favorite Martian, but before I do note that in looking up, I see a photo of you playing Greg Brady's on-again, off-again girlfriend in a few of the episodes of the Brady Bunch. Did you, despite your father's wishes, say, I want to act, or what?
Well, I think that part of it was that I had these 6 other kids in my family all the time, which was hard for me because I was an adolescent going through that, and it's hard for any adolescent girl. You know, once you hit 13 and the hormones kick in, it's tough. But I think that I was a little resentful of these other 6 children who were always in my family, and they were going to the Grand Canyon and Hawaii, and you know, my brother, because he was associate producer at that point, was going along with them, and my mom and dad and these other 6 kids would go off, and it was kind of about them a lot, and I felt kind of left out. So at one point I decided, well, I'll do that too. Maybe I'll, be able to get my own kind of attention with it that way. And so every once in a while, Dad would say, I have a show coming up, and you could play this role or you could play that role. And so I would do it. But my dad always said, if there's anything other than acting that you can do it.
And before I just move back to my favorite Martian, you said were the Brady family, especially because you would have been, I guess, when that came on in '69, you would have been just you've just becoming a teenager. Did you I guess, become friendly with Maureen McCormick, or the gal who played Jan, whose name slips my mind, who played Jan? Eve Plum. You were about the same age as them.
I was the same age as Maureen McCormick, and I'm still friends with her.
Okay.
We became very close friends during the show, and I spent a lot of time, especially with Maureen and Barbara Chase, who was Florence Henderson's daughter. The 3 of us we'd have slumber parties and go to each other's houses and go to parties, and we were often together. And I still am friendly with both of them.
Okay. Well, I'll get back to that in a little bit when we get up there. Let me turn then back to my favorite Martian. The shows that your father had worked on in television, and even going back to radio, were in a sense more traditional. When the 1960s hit, you talked about the difference between your brothers, and one of the the things in television in the 1960s that became the buzzword was high concept. And this is shows about monsters like the Addams Family and the Munsters, My Favorite Martian, My Mother the Car, eventually Gilligan's Island, Get Smart, The Monkees, all of these wacky kind of situational comedies that really broke a lot of the boundaries that were set by people like the Skeltons and the Lucille Balls and the Jackie Gleasons of the world. Did your father have any? Was he one of the creators of My Favorite Martian, or was he just a hired gun there?
He was not one of the creators. He was brought in because when they were first doing the show, they were finding out that some of the episodes were not working. And my dad had a good reputation of making things work that weren't working before. And he had done that a lot with Red Skelton. He would kind of reformat the show or bring in elements that weren't necessarily considered before. So when My Favorite Martian was not working well, they brought, it was working well as far as some of the episodes that had been shown, but the ones that were coming up, they were worried about, and they didn't know what to do, and they brought my dad in to take a look at it and see what his opinion was. Mm-hmm. And he came in, and his opinion was very strong. He felt that when they focused on Tim, the human, that it negated what the fun of the show was, that more of the series should be devoted to what was the unique element of the show, which was the Martian. Yeah. And so he skewed a lot of the storylines back towards the Martian's point of view, rather than going with the Tim point of view, which the writers had tended to go to. So he was brought on as a writer and basically a doctor for the series at that point, but though he did not create the show.
Okay. It says it lists him as a script supervisor, so I guess he took over, I guess you would call the vision of that show?
I think the vision of the show was there as far as the Martian landing and all that, and the relationship between the two. He just angled it slightly differently in his belief that the thing that people were turning into was really the unique element of the Martian.
Well, let me turn then to Gilligan's Island. How many years did your father have this idea? Because it's not just like you get an idea, you turn it in, and then 2 months later you're working on, an open lot or whatnot. So the show itself premiered in 1964. Did your father have the idea for this in the late 50s or what?
A few years before. He had been trying to come up with a scenario where people would be stuck together and need to learn together and overcome their differences. Mm-hmm. And he had thrown out a few ideas as far as workplace kind of thing and the more traditional ones. And he'd actually gone to sleep one night and he woke up in the middle of the night and it just hit him like a thunderbolt. He said, "An island. What if they're stuck on an island? They can't get away from each other and they have to learn to work together." Mm-hmm. And he woke my mom up and he said, honey, I've got it. They'll be stuck on an island. And my mom said to my dad, "Go back to sleep." Mm-hmm. That's how it originated in the middle of the night one night, where it just kind of came to him that it would be a scenario where you'd have disparate type personalities who would need to work together to learn to get over their differences. Because as I said before, my dad was very much an optimist and a people person and believed in the vision that people could actually overcome differences, work together. And he always told us that every show he ever created was based on that.
Yeah. Well, I believe, and I did a show earlier, about a year and a half or so ago, and I've written a few essays online, where I think that Gilligan's Island is one of the top 10 all-time American sitcoms, despite it often being trash, and I think infamously the head of CBS canceled it in favor of bringing back Gunsmoke for the 12th or 13th season, and he thought it was an idiotic show. But to me, and I'll talk about Brady Bunch in a minute, the reason for its success is it's the absolute pinnacle of American absurdism. If Samuel Beckett were to come up with an idea for a kind of show, he would do this. And the shows are, to me, wonderfully acted. On these limited ideas of a script, something happens, someone comes to the island, something falls on the island, The crew, the castaways, basically think, oh, now we can get off or whatnot, and putting aside the fact that the professor should have made at least a usable, serviceable raft. But then Gilligan inevitably fucks things up. Everyone forgives him, and the show goes on. And the very fact that the show didn't really have an official ending, and I'm putting aside the 4 or 5 movies with the Globetrotters and whatnot later on, gives it that almost Dantean like, that they're in this purgatory in a sense of the same thing. They do the same things. There's the big spider one. There's the one with the who is it, Zsa Zsa Gabor, and all of these weird things that happen. But the one thing I have to ask, though, is there's a story that your father supposedly thought that the 7 characters were either the 7 virtues or the 7 sins, or a cross-section of America. And I know a lot of now contemporary historians would say that just sounds nonsensical, because there wasn't at least one black person, or if they came from Hawaii, there should have been at least one Hawaiian on the boat. Was that sort of an after-the-fact made-up thing, that your father had this vision of a cross-section of America?
He believed it was a microcosm of society. I think had it been done today, there would be a black person on there. Definitely, there would have been all sorts of interracial kind of. There would have been perhaps somebody, a Latino person, or an Asian person. I don't know, but and my brother Lloyd and I often speak of that, because we would love to see that, because I think Dad, at that point in TV time, that wasn't done. And it wouldn't have even been a possibility. But I think at this point in time, it would be a good idea. Mm-hmm. But when he went into his first meeting to try to sell the show, he said, this is a microcosm of society. And the executive said, I thought you were coming in with a sitcom. And Dad had to completely just not refer to it that way, or it would skew the meeting. And he wanted to get his show on the air. Mm-hmm. I think it became, and the very first pilot, the 3, the professor and Marianne and Ginger, who were different, they were secretaries, were not as extreme in their character elements as far as Ginger or Marianne. So I think that they were brought up to match the other more extreme characters of the millionaire, or whatever.
Yeah. Well, I want to talk a little bit about the casting, and there's plenty of backstage kind of stuff, both on Gilligan's and Brady Bunch, and I don't want to, get into Greg Brady wanted to date his mom or something. But let me just ask about some of the main 7 characters and the main 7 actors on the show. And first off, did you actually go on set? Did you meet them? Do you have any, did you once bake a pie with Dawn Wells or anything? What was your experience with those actors, if you met them?
I met them often. My grammar school, when I was the show came on when I was 7, but I went 7 through 10, and I was going to a school right down the street, and my best friend, her dad was producing Get Smart at the time, and so they were both being filmed at the same lot. So after school, we just walked down the hill and would go see my dad, go to the set, and we'd always say, okay, is it going to be the island today, or are we going to go off into chaos, Because it was those were our options. We spent a lot of time on the CBS lot. We were always playing in the Wild Wild West trains and things like that. And I spent a lot of time with the castaways at the lagoon. And the one who really took a kind of a maternal role towards me was Dawn Wells, and she and I are still close friends. I loved her outfits, and I would always want to get an outfit just like hers, but in my size. So she would take me shopping, and we would try to find matching outfits so I could look like Marianne. And I was really scared of Jim Backus, because he had a very, very loud, booming voice. Yeah. And not that he ever did anything specifically to scare me, but just the tone of his voice was loud, and I was very little. And I loved everybody on that show. I was always surprised that Tina Louise was kind of more offense corner with an umbrella all the time. She was always sitting under a parasol to keep the sun from her, and not so much a part of the whole family that were the other castaways.
Well, as I said, both the Brady Bunch and Gilligan's Island have their own sort of behind-the-scenes lore. And I mentioned Robert Reed as famously being disgruntled on Brady Bunch, but Tina Louise, in a sense, has well been known to think that the Gilligan's Island tanked her career. But in reality, I mean, I never really understood that, and I'm not trying to rag on her because, I mean, she had a few little parts. I think her biggest role before Gilligan's Island might have been in that Dean Martin spy spoof series, the Bonds. I think she had a role on that. And, she was certainly a very beautiful woman. She could have, I guess, been a sexer. She could have been, I guess, maybe the next Raquel Welch before Raquel Welch. But, I mean, people today always know Ginger or Marianne. What is your take? And again, I don't want you to, I'm not looking for any, bad stuff said. But do you think that has it ever made really sense to you why she resented the role so much?
I have a hard time judging anybody for how they perceive their own fame and how it's affected their lives. I think that certain people embrace it and certain people resent it. Certain people get over it and some people don't. I mean, if you look at Carol O'Connor going from Archie Bunker to the cop, when you say somebody's typecast, certain actors get over break through it and do other things, and other people don't. I don't know that it's applicable to every single person. I think that she felt that it was a detriment to her own progress of her career, and she was disappointed in that, and perhaps she still feels that way, and perhaps she embraces it, whereas Dawn Wells would always embrace it. Just still to this day is just delighted when people recognize her for the role, and I guess you have a choice. Even like with Eve Plum, she's the one who doesn't embrace the Bradiness of it, and the other ones just enjoy it and make it a positive part. But I think that's a personality thing too, and I have, I'm not the one who has to live with that kind of recognition and fame, and I think it's harder for some people than others.
Yeah, I know I've interviewed a number of actors. I've done like 23 actor interviews, and hopefully I'll interview more actors over the coming years. And a lot of them will talk about, I guess, from the late 60s or early 70s when the royalties for reruns, but they're not even that much after a decade or so. Do you think that part of it was that the show became so, I guess, phenomenally successful in reruns? I mean, it wasn't a super hit, Gilligan's Island, when it was on, but it was rerun constantly. I grew up in New York City. It was on Channel 11 WPIX. I mean, from 6 to 7, you'd see 2 episodes throughout the 1970s. Gilligan's Island was everywhere, and that they didn't substantially get more. Was there? Do you know if there was ever any resentment in any of the other actors as well? Maybe.
I think that there's probably some resentment there because nobody knew at that point, and their agents made the deals that they made based on what they knew at the time, and nobody took into account future things that we didn't know what was going to happen. So I think that there's a certain amount of resentment. I never understood it really when they would direct it to my dad, like he had anything to do with their deals, because he didn't. He made his own deal with the studio, and they made their deals with the studio through their agents. And what happened within those deals was kind of up to their agents and them. And just like my dad, the most important thing to my dad was that this was his show, and he wanted a piece of it because he created it.
So he did get a piece of it. It wasn't just the studio bigwigs.
He got a piece of it.
Yeah.
He got a piece of it. I mean, it's a complicated business matter that I'm probably not going to go into at this point.
No,
because
it's
the
not
rights
really
are divided crazy. But for him, he wanted his own, recognition in his deal that he created the show. And I think that that the actors, at one point, I believe they were offered through their agents and through their deal making after the first year, the possibility of going into a participation or a huge bonus. And at that point, again, if you don't know that something is 20 years down the line going to still be making money, you go for your huge bonus. and then you kind of regret it later, because if later things are still happening and you don't get a piece of it, then and you see your face up there, it's got to hurt. So I don't blame them for not feeling happy about that.
Yeah.
But I don't know that it really had anything to do with my dad and his deal.
Yeah. Tina Louise and Dawn Wells are the two surviving members of the original cast. Well, the original broadcast cast. I know you mentioned there were several other actors in the first pilot. And Dawn Wells has, unlike Louise, readily embraced it. She still does little online things in the Mary Ann character. She seems to be she probably has a picture somewhere like Dorian Gray, because she seems almost ageless. Do you meet someone like Dawn and the Brady kids? Do you go? Are they invited to like comic cons, or are there sitcom cons that you go to? Or that you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, there are like Hollywood autograph shows where they go and they sign things and they get their pictures taken and things like that. I know that some of the Bradys do that, some of them don't. And I think Dawn does that, and she loves to meet fans. Dawn's very people oriented, and she loves to be one-on-one with people who love the show, because she still loves the show. I love the show. That's I grew up on that set and adore the humor of it, the absurdity of it. I thought the casting was brilliant, and I loved every one of the actors on it. And I think that for Dawn, it's very much just she delights in that role and in the show, and in the fact that it still brings laughter and positive kind of happiness to a lot of the people in the country. And I think that some of the kids on the Brady Bunch do it. There was a Brady convention a few years ago, and some of the Brady kids did go there, and some of them didn't. Yeah. And they invited me. I was there with Lloyd, and people get together. And I think Susan Olsen, I believe, does the autograph shows. I think Barry, and I'm not sure about the other ones, but I think that they do.
Let me talk about Natalie Schafer, because of the 7 major cast members, she seems to be the most mysterious. In looking her up over the years on Google, and on occasions when I'd write something about Gilligan's Island or mention sitcoms, I know you can find a few little clips of her in movies from the 30s and whatnot. And she apparently was very tight-lipped about her age and her life, her backstory and whatnot. Was she approachable when on the set? Was she, or she? You said how Louise was always standoffish. What was Natalie Schafer like?
She was totally approachable.
Yeah.
And she had probably, of all the castaways, she had the dirtiest sense of humor. She just delighted in this ladylike person just delivering a really off-color joke. Yeah. She was very funny, and she was completely tight-lipped about her age. Nobody knew, including her husband, how old she really was. And on his deathbed, he had one request that she tell him her age, and she refused. She was a very funny woman. She became very close with my parents.
Yeah. Now, let's talk about Jim Backus. You mentioned how he had a loud, booming voice, and before Gilligan, he I guess, and even during Gilligan, I would think was he still I guess moonlighting as Mr. Magoo, because in the early '60s, Mr. Magoo was on television. Was he doing that character as well as Thurston Howell?
I would imagine so, but I don't know for sure.
And other than you being scared of his voice, was he approachable, or was he a rowdy drinker, gambler type?
I never knew him as a rowdy drinker. I just knew him as a very big personality. He was fun, and every one of the other castaways was really approachable and embraceable, and they were very kind to me when I was little. I felt very welcome on the set. And I learned very quickly when I was a little girl when to be totally quiet, not move, and when I could breathe again, and when the shot was over. And it was a very friendly set, and Bob was amazing, and Alan Hale was this big teddy bear of a guy, and they were all just really wonderful. And Russell Johnson was just warm-hearted, just a very kind guy. They all were. The only one that I just always remember kind of off in the corner was Tina.
Yeah. Well, I was going to mention Russell Johnson next, and I knew him even, well, concurrently, I was always a fan of 1950s sci-fi films and westerns, and so he had a long television and B-film history before that, and you know, uh, I know that he probably had, I would say, probably the most difficult role of the seven because he was, in a sense, maybe you could say Dawn Wells too, were the only straight men on of the group because all the other characters were in a sense over the top and wacky, and he was always sort of this eunuch like smart guy who never succumbed to the advances of the Ginger character or occasionally the Marianne character, and yet despite knowing just about everything, he couldn't get them off the damn island. And there's the story that he always wanted to actually be scientifically accurate. Was that something that's just a rumor, do you know? Or?
My dad always insisted that everything he did have at least some relationship to a scientific fact. Mm-hmm. That it had some basis, no matter how tangential. And I think that Russell was very happy about that because he could really commit to his character when he believed. And maybe Dad was making this up, maybe he wasn't. I don't know. But Dad did have a tendency to make stuff up on occasion, but he would always tell Russell there is an element of truth so that he as an actor could totally commit to what he was saying and believe what he was saying was accurate. And I think that was important to him because he was one of the few grounded characters in the show. And I think that he played it brilliantly. The fact that he never made them a raft, he never fixed the minnow, he couldn't do those things. That was one of the challenges that the writers always had. Was there had to be a reason why all these people would land on the island. There had to be some reason why they would leave and they would still not get rescued. That was their job. The mission of each writer was to come up with a reason why these people would not bring them with or would not tell someone about it, whether they get hit in the head or they get threatened or it gets competitive or whatever it was. They had to come up with something why all these people, because how many deserted islands it's like every week somebody's fighting this deserted island and none of them are taking them away. So it was always a challenge to find that element. That was probably the biggest element of the script writing that was a challenge to the writers.
And you mentioned Alan Hale, and like Dawn Wells, he seemed to really embrace the character for the rest of his life. You can find YouTube clips from the 80s and 90s. I guess he died in the early 90s of him still dressed as the skipper. So he basically was the skipper in terms of personality. This big, laughable, loving, fun-loving guy.
Yes, he was just absolutely gregarious and fun and big and cuddly and he was a real sweetheart of a guy. He was also the hardest one for the skipper was the hardest role to cast for the whole show.
Yeah. And Bob
the reason for that
okay.
The reason for that was always my dad said that he wanted a big strong guy that you wouldn't hate when he was hitting the little guy with the hat. And when he saw Alan Hale in the cafeteria, he looked at his face and said, that guy, if he hit a little guy on the head with a hat, I would still like that guy.
Yeah. Well, I think Hale and Denver, along with Klugman and Randall on The Odd Couple, and before them Carney and Gleason on The Honeymooners, are the three great television comedy teams. I think they're as good as Abbott and Costello or Laurel and Hardy ever were. But let me turn to Bob Denver. Was the show actually a vehicle for Denver, or did he have to audition for it? And the thing I've always found interesting is when I've read and seen interviews, Bob Denver was a really smart guy, and yet he was almost in a sense cast against type. He started out on the Dobie Gillis show as this beatnik character. I forget his name, and then
Maynard.
Yeah, right, and then he's playing this ultimate dope in I guess is it Gilligan? I guess supposedly it was Willie Gilligan, or he was never given a Christian name, just his first name, or his last name rather. So how did he get cast, or was the show a vehicle for him to begin with?
No, the show was not a vehicle for him. In fact, Dad had been considering Jerry Van Dyke as Gilligan to begin with, and when Jerry Van Dyke was offered a choice of Gilligan's Island or My Mother the Car, he chose My Mother the Car.
Whoops.
And the role, yeah, and the role became open, and Dad was impressed with Bob's work on Dobie Gillis, and he was so smart. He was a really very insightful, very bright guy who really loved slapstick comedy, and sometimes you have to be really smart in order to play dumb well.
Yeah.
Because it's not an easy thing to play convincingly, and you have to really understand the nuance of how he played it, and his love for that character. And he is another one who, like, throughout the years would come back and do Gilligan whenever, because he loved the character. He loved that type of humor, so it was right up his alley. He jumped at it, and I thought it was absolutely brilliant.
Did you have any one or two minor anecdotes about some of the guest stars? Because I think Kurt Russell guested there, and I guess he maybe a little bit older than you. Any?
The Jungle Boy.
Yeah.
Yeah. I really don't. I don't remember those kind of specifics. I was too busy being a little tiny kid.
Yeah.
So I remember. I really don't even remember which episodes I was there for watching. They all were like just part of the island. I was just kind of playing on the set a lot of the time.
Well, between Gilligan's Island, as we move on, and the Brady Bunch, it looks like there was another show called It's About Time that only lasted one season. And I have never even heard of this so I'm just looking up here. Apparently it involved astronauts or something. Was this something along the line of I Dream of Jeannie, or did you know anything about that, really?
No, I knew about that show. It was called It's About Time, and it was about two astronauts that went up in a space capsule that went so fast, so far, that it broke the time barrier, and when they landed on Earth, they come out and they're in the Stone Age with dinosaurs and cave people and stuff like that. And that's what the show was about. And there were the two astronauts that were, I can't remember off the top. One was Jack Mulaney, Frank Aletta and Jack Mulaney were the two actors who played the astronauts. And it was, the song became quite well known, even though the show didn't get the kind of ratings that Dad was hoping would be. And after the first, I think it was half a season, they decided that they would bring the cave people back to modern day instead of having everything taking place back then. And they tried it that way around, and that, I guess, didn't work so well either, because it didn't last very long.
Yeah. Well, let's then move on and talk about the Brady Bunch. We've mentioned here or there about it. And other than the Gilligan's Island, this is the show that your father's most known for. Gilligan's Island and the Brady Bunch are cornerstones of Americana. And I mentioned how my theory as to why Gilligan's Island is such a great sitcom and has lasted is that it's absurdism, and it's the purest form of American absurdism. And for many years, I sort of scratched my head as to why the Brady Bunch lasted. I could figure out Gilligan's Island's impact. And about a year or so ago, and this is what prompted me to ultimately want to do a show about your father, it hit me. And it hit me because I wanted to, hopefully later this year, I'm going to do an interview with the sons of the fellow who founded Gumby and they had a show called Davy and Goliath, which was for the Lutheran Church, which were these little morality plays. And I said, that's it. I said, the Brady Bunch is like a bunch of little secular morality plays that children can understand. It's almost like the Grimm brothers or Hans Christian Andersen set in the 1970s. And I think that's the enduring lesson, because if you look especially at the first 3 seasons, something always goes wrong. Bobby's jealous of this. The kids resent Alice. The sibling rivalry here or there. It's the two blended families that marry, and there are these little morality plays. Do you think that accounts for the success of the show?
I think that's part of it. I think that it really spoke to kids, and because there were various ages of kids, that any kid has like a kid to identify with. Mm-hmm. And I think that you're right in that assessment. But I also think that other than like Leave It to Beaver, there weren't very many shows on TV that actually looked at the world through the kids' point of view. Most of them were about the parents, whether it was like Dick Van Dyke or a lot of the other shows that had kids in them. It was really about the parents and their work, and then the kids were their kids. But Brady Bunch was one of the few shows that actually focused on the kids and their problems. Yeah. And I think that that's one of the things that made it really, really popular for kids, especially with the age difference, because they were staggered so much that any kid at any age could look at it and go, oh, I feel like Cindy in this one, or I feel like Marsha or Greg, and they're going through, like, even though it's not time-wise the same kind of thing because we're in a different generation, is the problems are a little different, but still a lot of the problems can be related to problems that were happening then.
Was the idea for the show based upon the Lucille Ball film Yours, Mine, and Ours? And I know there was Please Don't Eat the Daisies was around that same time. So there was this move towards, I guess, large families in Hollywood films and also television. Or what prompted the idea? Where did your father get the idea?
The idea was, first of all, it was way before those movies. And my dad read an article in the Times paper, LA Times, that for the first time statistically, blended families had a bigger percentage of people had blended families rather than a nuclear kind of mom, dad, kids, all one family. That for the first time, blended families had caught up and even surpassed, and there were more families that were blending families than were just singular families. And Dad immediately it was a very little article, and Dad cut it out and said, oh my God, everybody is going to be writing this show. I better register it right away. And he ran into the other room and he wrote a quick treatment and he ran down to the Writers Guild to register it, because in his mind, every single writer in Los Angeles was going to be reading that and having the same idea, and he wanted to get it in first. Mm-hmm. So he registered it, and then he went to the networks and was rejected by every single one of them until Yours, Mine, and Ours came out, and it was a hit, and he got a call from one of the networks saying, you know that show you brought in last year?
Yeah.
We want to talk to you about it now.
Okay. Now, since Gilligan's did last 3 years and had good ratings, you would think that they would have been more amenable to your father even before that film came out. Is that just the way of Hollywood, that you're hot 1 minute and the next year you're a has-been?
Yes. Definitively, yes.
Okay. Well, let us talk a little bit about that show. I would assume that the adult characters, the three adult characters, the mother, the father, and the housekeeper were cast first. Is that correct?
They, in a way, I mean, there were two sets of kids that they cast, depending on if they were going with a blonde mother and a brunette father, or the other way around. Huh. And they were like debating between that. But originally, when they cast the show, it was going to be Joyce Bulifant was going to be playing Carol Brady.
Yeah.
And she was far more she had more of a character than Florence Henderson. Florence Henderson was more like a real life kind of woman, yeah. where Joyce, not that she wasn't a real life woman, and she was fantastic, but she was a little more character-y.
Yeah.
And had like a cute voice, and was just. But when they decided to go with Ann B. Davis as Alice, it changed the dynamic, and they didn't want two, because Ann B. Davis was more character-y.
Yeah.
So they wanted a more grounded kind of a woman to play Carol Brady, and they felt that Florence Henderson accomplished that, and Joyce Bulifant didn't get to play the role, which I know was, and she's great, and it was her near miss of being Carol Brady.
Yeah, well, I know anyone who knows the name Joyce Bulifant can watch her like on the old game show networks, and she always had that kind of ditzy blonde kind of thing, and I enjoyed her on the Match Game, and I think she was on some Mary Tyler Moore episodes too.
Yes, she was.
But So Ann B. Davis, let me just talk about her because she was a veteran from the 1950s, the Bob Cummings show. Did you ever meet her, and what was she like?
Did I meet her before the Brady Bunch, or did
No,
I
no,
meet her?
during the show. I mean, what was
Oh
your?
yeah,
Yeah,
oh yeah.
yeah,
Ann B. Davis was one of the most accessible. She
uh,
was just very, very friendly and lovely to all the kids, and she was always really nice to me. And we kept in touch for years afterwards. When Lloyd and I wrote the musical, she flew in to see it and was always very supportive of everybody. And I at one point was like designing things. I would draw things, and she loved one drawing that I did, and so she took the drawing and she made it the back of her director's chair. Everybody on the Brady Bunch, there was this thing. A lot of the actors did needlepoint because there was a lot of waiting around time, and so they were all doing needlepoint. They all taught each other, and it was like a big thing they would do. And so Ann B. Davis took this drawing that I made and did a needlepoint version for the back of her director's chair. She was always very proud of that and would always like kind of sit in it and lean to the side so I could see that she was sitting in the one I designed. She was a real sweetheart.
I know, and there's a really good interview with her on, I think it's the EmmyLegends.org website, the television, the Emmy Awards. They have these massive interviews with lots of people, and it's about a 2 or 3 hour interview, and she's really interesting to listen to. Um, we mentioned Robert Reed before, and famously I think he was on The Defenders was the show he was on before, and so he came from this drama background, and I guess Shakespeare in the Park and whatnot. Why? And again, just like with Tina Louise, I don't want to over analyze it, but I've always found it odd though is that he was. It's a sitcom about a family with these kids, and yet why would he expect it to necessarily be what it wasn't inherently to be? And he seemed to always be unhappy. What was your take on him? Was he like Tina Louise off in the corner by himself?
More active. Tina was never antagonistic towards the show. As far as like on the set, she was just always kind of slightly removed, and it may have had something to do with some kind of just her feelings of just who she was as a person. She liked being alone. I don't know, but Bob Reed was like actively antagonistic, and it would often he and Dad would just lock horns, and he wanted the show to be something that he wanted it to be, and my dad, it was his show, and he felt that Bob was hired to do a particular role, and I don't think that Bob Reed actually ever thought it was going to last as long as it did. And he felt that it needed to be grounded in reality, and that everything had to be provable, and it was very. He was very strong in his opinions on it. He would walk off the set, and my dad would have to go trying to find where he was, and he was sometimes at his favorite little restaurant, and and everybody in the crew was waiting to do the scene, but he wouldn't do it because one of the lines. He looked it up and it was factually wrong, so he refused to do the scene. And he was very much like that. And my dad was always getting very he felt very exhausted by the whole process of trying to keep Bob Reed from walking off the set, and trying to he didn't want to have to turn the show into what Bob Reed wanted it to be, because it wasn't Bob Reed's show. It was hired to be an actor. So I think it was always frustrating for my dad, as well as it was frustrating for Bob Reed, because he took his role very seriously. And I think actually that's part of the success of the Brady Bunch. When you look at him play the role, his heart is in it.
Yeah.
And I think that, like Russell Johnson, in a way where he felt like he could commit to it when he felt like there was a kernel of truth in it. Yeah. And I think with Bob, he wanted it to be so truthful that he would reject it if it didn't fit his image of what a dad would say at that particular moment or stuff. And so when he did commit, it made it very real. And I think that emotional heart that he brought to it with his lectures and his thoughtfulness as a father, I think that was... I think that in a way it was hard for Dad, but in a way it was good for the show.
One of the things that's you can look online is some of these, Brady Bunch behind the scenes kind of movies from like cable shows of the late '80s or early '90s and whatnot. One of the more famous, I guess, stories about the Brady Bunch is that uh, Bob Reed did not do the final show, that what turned out to be the final show. He refused to do it, and that if the show had been picked up, and I guess they didn't know it was going to be canceled after the fifth season, that he was going to be written off the show. Were they going to do a Darren from Bewitched kind of thing and have a new Mr. Brady, or were they going to bring in, Mike's uncle? Do you have any idea what was the plan?
Well, my what I don't, again, I can't ask Dad now because he's gone. But my belief was, and I think I had reason for this belief, was that Dad was kind of fed up with dealing with Bob, and it was going to be that Mr. Brady was going to meet his end. But I was on the last episode. I was on that show that he wouldn't do. And he wouldn't do it because Greg's hair turns orange. And he didn't believe that a hair dye would turn somebody's hair orange. So he wouldn't do the episode. So my dad just
Well, how would you explain Carol Burnett to Lucille Ball,
Well, it was from this, it was... It was like a chemical reaction thing, or just that because it was a hair tonic.
Oh, okay.
That a hair tonic wouldn't dye hair orange, and he didn't believe that. He thought it was a ludicrous reason to do an episode that putting hair tonic on somebody's head would never ever turn it orange. So he refused to do it. And I think my dad had just at that point just had enough. He just didn't want to keep trying to force it into Bob's believability or not, because my dad it was a comedy show, and he liked kind of doing kind of crazy things every once in a while. And so I can't say for sure, but I believe Mr. Brady might have lost, might have met his end at that point once that season was done. But then as the movies came and the reboots and other like episode things that they did with Brady Girls Get Married and Christmas ones and stuff like that, he came back because he, as much as he would complain about it, he really loved the kids. He had a very strong relationship with all the kids and felt very paternal towards them. So I think that he didn't want anybody else playing Mr. Brady, and he came back to be with that family, even though it meant dealing with my dad again. And I actually witnessed quite a few outbursts from Bob Reed, and they were less than dignified.
Yeah. Well, I want to get back to Florence Henderson and the rest of the kids cast in a moment, but I just want to digress since you mentioned all of the offshoots or whatnot. Was your father involved in the infamous Brady Bunch Hour, and then the Brady Brides, and then I think it was the Bradys, which was called Brady something because they were trying to be like what was that show, 30 something?
My dad was not involved at all. In fact, didn't even know what was happening with the Brady Bunch Variety Hour. He and we didn't know that it was going on until it went on.
But wasn't it your father's show? I mean, weren't the characters under his? Wasn't they his creations?
Yep. Yeah. But he didn't know they were doing that. But they did that, and then the other offshoots, the Christmas one, and Brady Girls Get Married, and Brady Brides. He was involved. My brother took over with Brady Brides, and I was a writer on that show as well.
Yeah. But I mean, I'm just trying to understand just how legally, if Mr. and Mrs. Brady and the Brady kids were the concept. I mean, wasn't that an intellectual property right? Did your father sue?
No, Dad did not sue.
No?
There have been many occasions when Dad probably could have sued for things, and he did not.
Okay. Well,
he did not sue. He always felt that if the actors could be making a living and it could be helpful to them and it wasn't hurting him, that he was happy for them.
But he did. But he did get a cut of that show, didn't he? Not. I mean, he would have had to have gotten a cut of.
I do not know.
No.
I don't
Okay.
know the business of that particular show. I
Okay.
do know that he wasn't aware that it was even happening until it was like actually happening.
Yeah, and they also did. I believe the Brady kids had a Saturday morning cartoon show that ran for a year or two. Was your father involved in that?
He gave it his blessing. He
Okay.
wasn't involved in it.
Okay. Well, let me return to Florence Henderson. She was more known, I believe, in the 1960s as a singer on a lot of the variety shows of that era. Was this really her first major acting gig that you know? And what was her? Was she really like Carol Brady? Because she seems to have been that very warm and, very much like her character.
Well, Florence was very, very warm. She, first of all, going back to the beginning of the question, she was known as a singer and was known as a Broadway actress who did a lot of she did Sound of Music at one point. She was doing a lot of Broadway, and she was a wonderful actress and a wonderful singer. And as far as her being on the Brady Bunch, she had a very tough childhood. And I think she brought to Carol Brady the kind of mothering that she wished she had had. She felt very strongly about being a parent, and that's very apparent when you look at her kids. I'm very friendly still with Barbara and Joey, and it was very important to her to be a good mother, because her mother had left early, and she had always embraced the opportunity to present America with what she felt was like a really warm, caring mother.
Yeah. I want to talk just in a brief overview of the six main kids. Barry Williams played Greg. Chris Knight played Peter, Mike Lookinland played Bobby, Susan Olsen played Cindy, Eve Plum was Jan, and Maureen McCormick was Marcia, and they were staggered age-wise. Later this year or early next year, I'm hoping to do an interview with the actor Todd Bridges, and that show famously had a curse of the bad things that happened to the children actors there, and we had mentioned Leave It to Beaver and some of, I think, some things with some of the child actors in shows from the 60s. There were some bad things. The Family Affair was a show that notoriously had some bad things happen to it. The Brady kids, the actors, seem to embrace their roles. They seem to, with the exception of Eve Plum, as you mentioned, they seem to, I guess, go to these autograph signings here and there. But I know, like, Maureen McCormick had some issues. I don't want to get into it. I'm not into the gossip. But do you think that these young actors were actors first generally, or do you think they were mainly cast just because of the way they looked? Because it seems to me only Barry Williams has really pursued acting, and maybe Eve Plum for a while afterwards. I think Susan is a radio DJ, or she was, that kind of thing.
No, I think that they all pursued it in their own ways.
Yeah.
Each of them, again, you go back to growing up with this constant awareness from other people of your role and how that impacts your life, and each person's going to deal with it differently. I mean, I have a hard time judging any of them for how they react to it or don't react to it, because I don't have to live that. It's hard to be walking down the street when for the rest of your life you're going to hear, there's Marcia, wherever you go.
Yeah, Marcia.
That's got to be tough. Yeah. And some people are going to deal with it better than other people. And I think that that each of them has dealt with what their own aspirations are and were to their own paths. I think Barry he loved performing. He still loves performing. He's performing to this day. I think that Maureen every once in a while loves to do a movie, and when a role comes around, she did. Was it Patsy Cline? I think she played Patsy Cline in a movie. And you have Eve is she's doing some Broadway stuff. She did Grease when they did that live production. Susan was more interested in radio and more interested in that way of going. I think that Mike Lookinland just became, he didn't want to do it anymore, and there was no reason why he had to. So I think he was a cameraman for a while, but then he's now doing amazing like woodwork and countertop work. He does beautiful artistic work, and each of them. And Chris still, you see him every once in a while. He does things. He's like acts in things. He's had series, the My Fair Brady one, and everything. I think he's happy to embrace his Bradiness. I think most of them are. I think that Eve probably of all of them is the most reluctant to revisit Brady.
Yeah. I mentioned why I thought the show had a success in terms of being sort of these parables, but it's also got a reputation as sort of being the ultimate 1970s show because of the Greg Brady, the groovy stuff, the infamous Brady permanent waves for the men, that kind of thing, and there were several episodes where the kids sang. Do you think that the kitsch value and that it's been so widely associated, even though it started actually in '69, that it's so widely associated with that decade? Do you think that's also a part of the reason that people go back to it? I mean, even episodes have been acted out on stage.
Yes, I think that's part of it. I think it's got that kind of colorful. It captures that whole flavor of that era, which was you can laugh at it or you can identify with it. It's like there's a lot of people who just like think that the costumes were hysterically funny with all the stripes and the paisleys and things like that, and yet those were what people were wearing at that time. And so I think that snapshot of the 70s is a part of it, and I think that it's I think that there's something just very family friendly and safe about that show that parents still to this day feel like if whatever's on TV and they don't know, they have to watch this episode to see if there's something they would object to, but you can always put on a Brady Bunch episode and know that you'll be safe having your kids watch that episode. And I think that parents like to show their kids that show because it is a safe place.
While the Brady Bunch was still on network television, your father did a syndicated show with Bob Denver and Forrest Tucker. And I remember it because as a kid, it came on in the fall of '73. And after the third or fourth episode, I remember at the time Comet Kohoutek was in the sky. And I remember my parents made me miss part of the episode to try to see the comet. And yet, looking back on it, having seen it now on YouTube, some of the episodes here or there, it wasn't as good in my mind as I remembered, because I love Forrest Tucker from F-Troop, which was one of my favorite sitcoms of the mid-'60s, just as Gilligan's Island was, and Bob Denver. But it seemed to me sort of like a Wild West retread of Gilligan's Island. What was that the basic concept for the show, and do you think that's ultimately why it didn't have the success and the staying power that Gilligan did?
Yeah, I think you're probably right. I think that Dad had a formula he felt worked, and he loved Forrest Tucker's work, and he wanted to he loved the whole aspect of Gilligan's Island, and he wanted that again. I think that he still was feeling very much like what's another way to get people together that have to work out their issues, because again, that was what was driving Dad with every show, and he came up with this wagon train idea and thought that would be a fun vehicle, especially because he loved working with Bob Denver was just a joy to work with. So I think that it was a way that he felt like he could go down a familiar road with that, and it didn't work as well as the Gilligan. As at Gilligan's Island, obviously, because we're not still watching it.
Yeah. Looking at the next show that he did, I had no idea this show existed, called Big John, Little John. I guess it was a Saturday morning show, and it starred Robbie Rist, who played the infamous, Cousin Oliver from Brady Bunch. And it just seems like a really wacky plot. They find the fountain of youth and a fellow Morse back and forth between the two of them. Speaking of high concepts, what was that, and how did your father want to get into Saturday morning, or was it just sort of ghettoized there?
I think that it was he didn't imagine it at the beginning that it was Saturday morning, but that's where it landed because it had more appeal to kids than it would on a primetime show. But it was. I actually worked on that show as a dialogue coach, and I worked a lot with Robbie Riss. It was a really fun show, and it was a crazy concept, and that the adult would just like inadvertent, just boom, all of a sudden he was a kid, and then he'd go back and forth because the idea of it was when he drank from the fountain of youth, it destabilized his metabolism, and so it would without knowledge, without notice, rather, it would just he would go from like being a kid, being Robbie Riss, to being Herb Edelman, and so it was a fun show to work on, and I still think it's a funny show.
I want to get to Harper Valley PT in a moment, but between that and the Big John Little John, I think was when the first Gilligan movie came on, and that was I think maybe if not the highest rated TV movie of that year. In the top 2 or 3. Did your father have any idea in the late 70s that more than a decade on that the show had taken off and gotten this second wind? And I mean, the show really, I mean, it's not quite to the extent of, say, Star Trek, which also ran just for 3 seasons on network television, but that there was this wellspring of just wanting to see these characters again. Because what prompted... What did he approach with the idea of the movie, or was he approached to do a movie?
No, he had the idea. He said, I put them there. I think I have a right to get them off. So I think that he always wanted to do a movie because they didn't know the show was going to end when it ended, and they felt like it was kind of left high up in the air, which was kind of an interesting kind of, like you were saying before. It's almost like they're stuck there in perpetuity. There's some kind of this sitcom limbo where these people, the crazy people, are doing all these things every week, and you just think they're going to get off, and you think you're going to get off, and it's like, give the people what they want. Finally, let these people get off the island. So Dad had that. He had that idea, and he wanted to do the movie, and it took a while to convince people to do the movie. And Dad was really passionate about getting the movie done, and decided, I think at that point he was gonna like he wanted to pay for it himself because he was like so convinced that people would be interested in taking these people that they've now come to know, not only from the original airing of the series, but since it had such a life afterwards, that people were still interested in these characters and wanted to see them rescued. And he was right.
So, unlike the Brady stuff, your father was intimately involved in the revival stuff of Gilligan's Island.
Right.
Yeah.
Although Dad was intimately involved in Very Brady Christmas and Brady Girls Get Married, those movies he was very involved with. He wrote those with my brother and with uncles. So many uncles who were involved in various incarnations of Brady and Gilligan things.
Now, the Harbor Valley PTA television show, I remember that. I remember it was a fairly interesting show, but it seemed to not work. And as I recall, and again, it's well over 30 years, close to 40 years, I guess, since that aired. It seemed that they were constantly tinkering with that show. It had Barbara Eden, and I loved Barbara Eden from her I Dream of Jeannie days. Did your father, I mean, he was the producer of that show, but was he the producer of the original movie as well, or did they just approach him to produce the TV version?
They approached him to do the TV version. He was not involved in the movie or the song, and he thought it was a good idea, so he jumped at it because he thought it was a fun idea. I was, at that point, I was off at college, so I wasn't as aware of what was going on with Dad's show business decisions, because I was doing my own things and I wasn't around the house as much during that time.
And after that, I'm just looking at the last one listed here, as I guess is a major thing that your father had started, was a show called Either Together We Stand or Nothing Is Easy. And apparently this started Dee Wallace, who I guess is both best known for the role in E.T., and Elliot Gould. That's an interesting pairing. Uh, okay, and it looks like it says that okay, it was there was a spin-off from the Brady Bunch where they had I remember the black kid, the Asian
Kelly's
kid, and the
Kids.
white kid, and so this was a reboot of that, I guess.
Well, Dad always wanted to do a show where it was interracial.
Yeah.
He felt that that was really important sociologically to make a family where people in the family were learning to get along with people of other cultures, other races, or whatever. And he tried it with the Brady Bunch with Kelly's Kids, and it didn't go into a series, and I think he was disappointed in that. So when the idea of Together We Stand with a couple that has an interracial family came along, that he was very enthusiastic about that. I guess that the pairing of Dee Wallace and Elliot Gould, for some reason, the show wasn't catching fire. So after the first season, they decided to lose Elliot Gould, and so it went on for a while just with Dee Wallace. But again, that was during a time when I wasn't particularly around, so I know that the concept was always very important to Dad, because he was worried about the world and about society and about people learning to come to grips with people's differences.
Well, you mentioned that you were off at college and then doing some other things. When did you get back involved with the Brady Bunch or Gilligan's Island projects later? For example, like the Brady Brides or the Brady's, the drama version of the show, and the stuff throughout the '90s, the Christmas special. Were you involved in any of that with your father?
I was involved in the Brady Girls Get Married, the spinoff, the Brady Brides, and that was at a time when I had graduated college, and I was trying to make my way as a writer, but I really had wanted to work with my brother and my dad, because I just wanted to do it on my own and be my own kind of name with it. So I had changed my name, and I was working on other things, and through a series of events that eventually actually led up to me meeting my husband, I ended up working on the Brady Brides, and I was a story editor and a writer on that show, and it was a really fun show, and it didn't last as long as we'd hoped it would. But what show does? You keep, every time you do a show, you kind of hope that it'll have legs and it'll keep going, and you'll get to do it for a long time. And we were really hoping that show would keep going, but it kind of ran into timing issues and all sorts of it didn't. So and then I was on the Brady's. I wasn't involved as a writer, but I did play a part on one of the episodes as Bobby's nurse that gets kind of into a flirtatious thing with Peter. I guess I moved from Greg to Peter. I don't know. Younger man.
You mentioned that you used I guess a pen name. Did you do any pilots, or did you pen any ideas or pitch any ideas for shows yourself?
Oh yeah, I was busy writing spec scripts and having meetings, and I had a few that were on hold. And when my dad asked me to come and be a writer on Brady Brides.
And you mentioned your husband. I was just looking him up. Did you meet him? I guess he at the time it says he was with Wings, so I guess that might have been before you knew him with the Paul McCartney post-Beatles band. Did your father ever feel that, oh, you shouldn't marry a rock star? Look at what happened to Valerie Bertinelli kind of thing.
Actually, Lawrence was the first person that I was involved with that my parents liked. My parents had hated everybody I'd ever brought home before, and I was really surprised. But my parents loved him from the moment he walked in the door.
So your father died, what, about 5 or 6 years ago? What was he doing in the first part of this century. Was he still pitching ideas, or was he mainly just sort of, I guess you might say, shoring up his reputation in the business? Was he still active?
He was still active. He was writing until 2 days before he died. I mean, well, actually, no, about 9 days before he died. My dad wrote plays, and they got put up. He had one play that premiered when he was in his 90s. He was still writing ideas for shows. He had movie scripts that he was working on. He was constantly active, and he was always answering fan mail. He answered every piece of fan mail that came in himself, and would send autograph things and send off pictures. And he felt very fortunate and very honored that he had been a part of people's lives and they still cared. So he spent a great deal of time kind of responding to people's requests, and he was very charitable. He gave much of his money to charity,
Yeah.
and he was very involved in a lot of charities that were important to him. Very philanthropic, and he was working on like an autobiography, kind of a memoir of his family, which I actually have here.
Oh, okay.
And he was working on that, and I was helping him edit that. And when I came up to edit one day, the fire trucks and the emergency vehicles were there, and that's when they took him in for his final trip to the hospital.
I want to ask a little bit about what you think the legacy of your father's work is. I mentioned, I mean, obviously the Brady Bunch, and before that, Gilligan's Island are the sort of two big cornerstones. Your father had eventually, I guess, he got a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. Do you think that your father ultimately felt that he made the right decision? Because you said how he originally wanted to be a doctor. I guess there's that philanthropic help the world kind of impulse there. Or was sometimes, because even sometimes the most successful people will sometimes say, I had great monetary success here or whatnot, but in my heart of hearts, I should have done this. Did your father ever regret going into the show business rather than medicine?
A tiny piece of him, I think, did. He always kept his medical. He had like a black leather medical bag. He always kept it on the side of his desk, even till into his 90s. And I think when my brother became a doctor, that was he felt very fulfilled that somebody had become a doctor. But I think, and I would have often conversations with him where I said, laughter is medicine, and you probably treated more people than you could have as a doctor, because you raised generations of families and children and created safe environments and friendly, happy entertainment for people that really enriched their lives, probably more than you ever could have done seeing one patient at a time. But I think that he did know that he made the right choice, and he was very proud of the work that he did, and that it was so optimistic and so family friendly, because kids were really important to him. But I think there was just a tiny piece of him that always kind of wondered if he could have cured cancer.
I want to just talk a little bit about the estate and the intellectual property rights for both Gilligan and the Brady stuff. Infamously, James Joyce's grandson often tried to extort exorbitant prices for any reworkings of James Joyce's material and whatnot. And we mentioned how, like, the Brady Bunch has had some stagings of episodes, and I think Gilligan's Island even had a stage adaptation. And if someone came like now and wanted to do, I think, wasn't about a decade ago, there was supposed to be a revival of Gilligan's Island as a movie or a television show. I would assume you and your brothers are the executors of your father's estate. What do you look at, for example, if someone came to propose to you, like we talk about a multicultural Gilligan's Island, or some kind of 21st century revival of maybe an interracial Brady thing, where Mr. Brady is black or Mrs. Brady is black or Hispanic or whatever. do you get proposals like that often? Do you look at them and say, nah, Dad wouldn't want to do that, or Dad would approve this? And if let's say some some small theater wanted to do something and they didn't have the money for the rights, how do you approach when people approach you for things like that?
Well, first of all, as far as musicals go, my dad wrote the Gilligan musical with my brother, and my husband and I wrote the score. So we're very happy when people put that on. In fact, there's a production going up in Melbourne in February, and my dad was thrilled about it. He asked, I had a comedy rock and roll band all through the 80s into the 90s, and Dad loved the songs that I was writing, so he asked me and my husband to do the score to the musical. So we did that with him, so that's not a problem. As far as the Brady musical, I wrote it with my brother Lloyd, and Lawrence and I wrote the score to that one. And we're very happy if productions go up on either of those shows. As far as other possibilities, when the Brady Bunch live was happening in Chicago, my dad went to see it, and the Paramount people wanted to shut it down because it was using Brady Bunch. And my dad, in going to see it, he thought it was funny, and he came back and he said, let them continue doing it, but just make sure that they pay the writers of the episodes that they're taking off, make sure they pay them royalties. So they did that. They made an agreement for that, and that's when it went on to be a stage production at a bunch of other places. But and that's what eventually led to the movie, the Brady Bunch movie. As far as the other show ideas in terms of multicultural, multiracial things, I and my brother have many treatments and many ideas for that we would love to eventually see get done. It's very complicated. There are rights holders, especially with Gilligan. There are rights holders that are divided up, and we're not in control of all the rights, and everybody has to agree on everything. And because Warner Brothers is a third rights holders, they have to want to make a movie or want to make a TV show. And as of yet, they are not going forward with that at this particular time, and it's a little bit of a frustration for my brother and myself, because we would love to see the legacy continue, and we would love to see it updated to include, as you said, like a Brady interracial. We have a treatment for that. My brother and I, we have a treatment for pretty much every show that you have talked about, but we have to get other big, huge, these big institutions on board. And in Hollywood, it's never easy. And as hard as it was for my dad to get shows on, it become more complicated and more difficult. Especially, hello, hi. Oh, my husband just walked in. Oh. Yeah. Okay. My husband's going off to my daughter's. So. Okay.
Well, we'll be done. We'll be done in about 5 minutes. So.
Hold on. 1 second. Bye. Okay. Love you. Bye. Okay. So, okay, I'm back.
Okay. So let me just wrap up. As I said, we'll just wrap up in about 5 minutes. So I assume that while you have the rights to the characters of Gilligan and Mr. Brady, that there are distribution rights that are held, rebroadcast rights, that kind of thing, right?
It's very complicated business-wise. Okay. Luckily, I have an entertainment attorney brother who knows about all those things.
Okay.
And he takes care of that. It's there are rights to the actual films, and then there are rights to the concept, and there's like all different divisions and who owns the underlying rights. Like with Brady, it's CBS own the underlying rights. We can't do anything with it without CBS wanting to do it first.
Okay.
And with Gilligan, it's divvied up into even more of a pie, and it's very complicated. And I wish it weren't, but it is. And so we do what we can when we can.
Okay.
And we would love Dad's legacy to continue, because I think that there's actually need for it more now than ever before.
Well, let me just ask then about the legacy now. Since your father has been dead a few years, where do you see your father's place, say, in television history? His greatest success was basically in the first 30 years of the medium. Do you think that where would you put him? Do you look at him as one of sort of these, I guess you call icons, in the sense the way people would look back at some of I don't know, Huntley and Brinkley, or for television news, or Jackie Gleason for the sketch shows, or Goodman and Todson for game shows? Do you think your father's place, I guess, in situation comedies especially, where do you view that?
I think he was a pioneer of sorts in situation comedy, and I think that he was an icon. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know what qualifies as an icon. I think that for me, he was. I always respected what he brought to the world in terms of the flavor of television that he gave us, and I think that it will survive, because it is art in it is completely pure to itself. I think that Gilligan is so absolutely consistent unto itself, and Brady is consistent unto itself, and that when you're the epitome of something like that, it tends to continue on. Just like in music, there are certain epitomes that, like, some groups will come and go. I'm not comparing Dad to the Beatles, because you really can't, but they're never going to go away. And I think that there will always be some station where you're going to be able to see Gilligan or Brady, and I think that would be really delightful to Dad. If he were here, he would be thrilled that it continues on, and I think that he would really love to have seen it come into the modern age that we're in and continue on in terms of multicultural. I think that would have been very satisfying to him.
Well, I do think that Gilligan's Island, especially, and to a lesser extent, I think the Brady Bunch, will be probably explored by cultural sociologists looking back at 20th century life in the West. Even if it's 1,000 years from now on some other star in some academy that's yet to be founded for 500 years. Let me just ask you personally then, regarding your father's work or just your own stuff, what is next for you? You said you had your father's book that he was writing about his family. Are you trying to get that published?
No. He wrote it right before he died, and okay. I wrote the last chapter of it when I came up to the house, and that was actually just for us. He just wrote it because he wanted the family to have a record of all of his stories that he would always tell when he was growing up. It's really kind of a personal memoir, and all of us have a copy of it. And some things he just wrote for us, just to have. So I don't think that we're going to pursue that as publishing it or anything. I'm glad to have it. But for me, I've been writing. I have plays, and I have a band that I'm working on now. I had a band all through the 80s. It was a comedy rock and roll band called Housewives, and we did a lot of television and did a lot of appearances. And it involved my husband and myself. And after I put that project to bed in the 90s, I found a need to come back with it again as of November. I now have a political rock and roll group, and I've been doing protest songs. So I have a website, and we have an album, and we're starting to do shows, and it's important to me.
Okay. Well,
because of everything that's going on.
As we wrap up in a minute, just please send me the link to your website. I'll link to it underneath this website. I'll also, if you don't mind, I'll link to your PlayScripts page as well. And so I want to thank you for spending a couple of hours talking with me about the life and legacy of your father.
Do you want to hear any other stories that I have that I think you might like?
Oh, sure. Go ahead. I didn't know how long you had, but go ahead. If you have some anecdotes, go ahead before we wrap up.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
One of one of my favorite anecdotes was when I was 13 years old, and I had heard of a group called The Committee, which was the first improvisational comedy group in California, and they were operating out of San Francisco. And I decided that it would be a good idea if my friend Cindy and I got on a bus and went up to San Francisco to see The Committee. So I went to my parents and I said, here's the deal. Cindy and I want to go and get on the bus and go to San Francisco to see The Committee. Now, this, again, it was 1969 and we were 13. So my dad said, hold on a minute, wait a minute, we have to think about this. We have to, just talk to Cindy's parents and I'll get back to you on it. So I was really impatiently waiting for about a week until my dad called me in and he said, we've been thinking about it and we've talked to Cindy's parents and yes, you can go. We were completely stunned. We had no idea that they would actually approve of this, but we were so thrilled and excited about this adventure. So Dad and Mom drove us to a Greyhound station, and we had our little suitcases, and we got up on the Greyhound bus, and it started up the coast to San Francisco. And it took a while. It took about 6 hours because we stopped along the way. And we get up to San Francisco, and we're coming off the bus, and there are my parents. My mom and Dad had flown up there, and they had no intention of letting us go to San Francisco by ourselves, but they wanted us to think we were. And to me, that was one of the quintessential Brady things that my dad did.
Huh. That's pretty interesting. Do you have another one you want to tell? I mean,
yeah. When I was in high school, I was thinking about this morning, just because I was watching the news, and I was thinking about this a lot, and it brought up a memory. And when I was in high school, it was the Vietnam War was going on, and I was very passionately against it. And there was a big day that was coming up nationally that was a day of national protest. And I decided that it would be a good idea if our high school had a walkout, and we all went down. There was a military recruitment center, and they were going to be doing like this news show there. So I thought, I'll get all these students together, and we would all walk down to this recruitment center. So we kind of went student to student to student. We were all talking about it, and I organized this walkout. So on the day, I guess the teachers had heard about this, and on the day of the walkout, they chained our gates, and we were locked in. And all of us had gotten to the gates with our signs, and we were intending to walk out, but we couldn't because we were chained in. And I was looking at everybody, and they were all kind of looking to me as to what to do. And they said, what are you going to do? So I said, I'm going to climb the fence. So I climbed over the fence, and after I did, all the other students jumped over the fence, and this huge mob of us with big signs went all the way down to the center, and we got, there were news crews and everything else. Well, about a week later, I get called into the principal's office because they want to talk to me because they knew that I had organized this, and I was in trouble. So I walked into the office, and my mom and dad were there. And the principal said, your daughter was the organizer of this big protest event, and it was very disruptive, and she climbed over the fence, and half the student population went with her, and I think we need to be dealing with her in some way. What do you think we should do? And so my dad turned to me and he said, was this very important to you? And I said, yes, this was very important to me. So he turned to the principal and he said, well, then I think you should tell her she did a great job.
That's really nice. Would that most people had parents as understanding and supportive.
Yep.
By the way, I just wanted to ask, did your girlfriend's parents know that your parents were going to fly up to San Francisco? I would assume that's why they approved her to go.
I think they were in on it. I think they were in on it.
Okay.
And that actually was interesting because that episode led me to writing the play that I just got published.
Uh-huh.
Because meeting Gary Austin, who was in the committee at that time, and he became our coach for the Housewives, which was my comedy band. He came down to LA and he founded the Groundlings Theater.
Oh, okay.
And having founded the Groundlings Theater, and I was taking improvisation with Gary Austin, it's when I first got the idea to write Without a Net, which was the play that you found on Play Scripts.
Okay. Well, again, it was very nice talking to you. It was interesting to hear the anecdotes about your father, and I will link to both the play scripts, and as I said, just send me the link to your music site too, and I'll link to that under here. So thanks again for spending a couple of hours talking to me about your father and yourself.
Oh, you're welcome. I love talking about my dad because I love my dad. And I'm sorry I made me cry.
Okay.